Hi folks, hope you're doing very well. It's another tone analysis video today, and this time I'm focusing on Angus Young's tone from AC/DC's Back in Black. This of course was and still is a legendary album, one of the biggest selling albums of all time, and rightly so I'd say. I myself was a complete AC/DC nut when I was a kid. I knew every song, well, at least the chords to every song, and it just consumed my musical world for a good number of years as a kid. So it really was quite a thrill for me to put this video together, because I was going back and having a bit of a nostalgia trip and really analysing all of these songs again. It was good fun. And I seem to have timed it pretty well, because AC/DC have a new album coming out, which is Power Up, which I, of course, will be listening to, as should you. So clearly it's all worked out really rather beautifully. I just want to quickly dive in here just to mention that I've actually run into a bit of trouble with some copyright issues around these Back in Black tracks. Should have seen it coming really. It's a very well-known album and probably has a lot of strict copyright rules, but there you go, you live and learn. So what I've had to do, as you have heard on the intro now, is replace some of these tracks, if not all of them, we'll see how it turns out, with my own AC/DC style creations. So I hope they do the job and they stand in good enough and they sound realistic enough to you guys. Anyway, on with the video. So I think it's about time we crack on and talk about this tone and how Angus went about getting his tone for Back in Black in the first place. Before I start prattling on about the guitar tone specifically, I want to give a mention to the producer of this particular album and a few other albums with AC/DC, and then all the rest of the people that he's worked with. The producer I'm referring to, of course, is Robert Mutt Lang. He's worked with countless high-profile musical acts like Def Leppard, Foreigner, Bryan Adams, Billy Ocean. The list goes on and on and on. We'd be here all day if I listed his credits, but there you go. Now, as far as AC/DC is concerned, Mutt started producing for them on the Highway to Hell album, which arguably is just as great an album as Back in Black. This would explain why the two albums Highway to Hell and Back in Black have a similar production style in terms of the overall mixing and the guitar tones and whatever else. But when you're asking those in the know, they tend to say that Mutt was sort of getting used to working with AC/DC and crafting their sound in Highway to Hell, and he did a great job, but he really nailed it on Back in Black. That's when all of his knowledge of working with them and the tones that they were after really came together, and he hit the sweet spot magnificently. I think the only other album he did with them was For Those About to Rock, which didn't quite have the same commercial success as Back in Black, but nonetheless still a great album. But I think without Mutt's direction in the recording studio and taking on AC/DC's very much if it ain't broke, don't fix it attitude, I think perhaps the album might not have been quite so successful and brilliant. Especially as it was an album leading on from the previous lead singer Bon Scott's untimely death. That's a hell of a comeback. Anyway, enough rambling about the production and the producer. Let's get down to why we're all really here. The first and very important and iconic part of this guitar tone is obviously the guitar. And the reason I say iconic is because Angus used Gibson SGs almost exclusively for his entire playing life. And very fortunately for me, I have access to a particularly lovely bit of Gibson SG history. And what I have here is a 1972 Gibson SG Deluxe. This was gifted to me very kindly by my stepfather on my 21st birthday, and it's a guitar that I did actually have access to when I was growing up, and I felt very fortunate about that because, like I said earlier, I was an AC/DC superfan, and to have a genuine Gibson SG in the house from the 70s was a huge thrill for me. All the parts on this, as far as I know, are original. It's a little worse for wear. It's got some dints and bashes from its history in the family. And at some point down the line, I just want to make some very minor changes to the guitar's playability, because I really want to be able to take this thing out and gig it where possible. As it stands, the intonation's a bit out of whack, and the electronics are all a bit faulty. For instance, the volume pots only work properly when they're on full, and if you roll down below 8, there is no sound at all. And that will become more relevant later on, as I will explain, but I'm just pointing it out now so you know. But otherwise, for all intents and purposes, this is pretty much the perfect guitar to test this tone with. And you're all going to hear it in action properly very shortly. But now it's time to move on to the amp and other tone components that make up this wonderful sound. Right, so starting with the amp, Angus obviously is very, very well known for using Marshall amps pretty much exclusively, much like his SGs. And it usually seems to me, from what I could find about his amp usage, among those Marshall models, Super Lead 100s tend to be used most commonly. The Helix's answer to the Super Lead 100 is the Brit Plexi model, and I'm using the Brit Plexi Bright, as you can see. He did occasionally use other Marshall models for his solo sounds or darker, more saturated, overdriven rhythm tones, like the JCM 800 2203. But yes, in this case, I wanted to try and sort of cover the broad spectrum of his sound as much as possible. And just to briefly mention, the cabinet sim I've gone for is the 4x12 Greenback 25, which is based on the Marshall basket weave kind of cab models you'd get with the G12M25 speakers installed. I'm not sure if this is the exact right model for this purpose, but it certainly sounds right to me, and you know, if you look at the real thing in real life, it kind of looks the part, so I've gone with that in the end. So let's just see how the amp and cab sound together by themselves so far. Now, if you weren't totally convinced by that tone, I know what you mean, but don't worry, there is more to it. Angus is normally associated with guitar straight into amp, you know, he's one of those old school guys, and that's mostly true, but there is one important component in between, the Schaffer Vega Diversity Wireless System. This system was the first commercially available wireless in the early mid-70s when AC/DC were well and truly into their touring, and Angus's onstage antics, you know, running around like an absolute lunatic, God knows where, made it a very convenient addition to his simple rig. The other huge benefit that came from using the wireless was that it added a clean boost to his signal, which was intended for the purpose of boosting any signal loss through the wireless transmission to the amp. But this ended up pushing the amp harder and adding extra compression and perhaps some richer harmonic content to the signal. This then became so essential to his tone and his sound that it got to the point where when they were recording Back in Black, Angus didn't feel right recording his guitars without it. It's comparable to Brian May's use of the treble booster, as I discussed in his tone analysis video. What I've gone for to replicate the boost to the signal that the Schaffer preamp would add is the Kinky Boost, which is based on the EP Boost, which is in turn based off the Echoplex preamp boost that you'd get. So many guitarists loved using the Echoplex because of the preamp and how it added to their sound, much in the same way that Angus loved the Schaffer. So I'm hoping it adds the same sort of effect to the overall sound. So let's check it out. Now, I know a lot of you will be hearing that and thinking, what is he doing? That is way too much gain, way too much saturation. But hear me out, because I think from what I've seen and heard, Angus is one of those people that manipulates his volume pot and tone controls actually quite a lot. And if you bear that in mind for this, you can see how he alters his sound in terms of how much gain and saturation is applied to it for rhythm and lead parts. Now you see, I told you that volume pot issue was going to be relevant. So in place of a faulty volume pot in my case, I'm having to use a volume pedal, and I'm placing it in the chain in such a way as to come before the wireless boost, as it were, and the amp, so that it will hopefully behave in a similar fashion to how a guitar volume pot would work, because it's placed in the same part of the signal chain. So let's take a listen to how that's going to work in action. It's at this point I want to touch on briefly the importance of a player's fingers contributing to the tone. What I'm going to talk about here specifically is Angus's use of very quick and quite aggressive vibrato. This is something that I actually really struggle to replicate because over the years of my playing, my vibrato has evolved into something a bit different, a bit slower, smoother, and that's not necessarily a good thing. I'm just saying, my vibrato is different. But when trying to replicate the sound of Angus, you kind of need to bear in mind that he has certain quirks in his playing style that will just sound like him. So whenever I've been trying to play these examples to you guys, I've tried my very best and my damnedest to do a very quick vibrato for you, much in the style of Angus. Moving on to this very subtle slapback delay. This isn't always part of the guitar tone for AC/DC songs across the board, but it seems to crop up a few times, in particular for their more recent records that I've noticed, and prominently on the solos. I noticed it on the song Back in Black whenever I heard the intro with a count in. There is just a slight and very short echo, so I put one in the signal path out of curiosity, and it seemed to add the correct ambience for the tone on that album to my ear. Once it's in the full band mix, you don't really hear it as much. It's very subtle, but it's just there. There is also a reverb I've put in there for a bit of general ambience. It's sort of an always-on feature. Nothing too crazy, it's just to soak up the harshness a little. However, when you do hear it on its own, when it's just the guitar by itself, it does stand out and it sounds quite atmospheric in a way, which is why it works perfectly for this intro. Another thing I felt I had to add to the sound was some EQ adjustments. Now, it made sense to me to do this because what I was referencing from was a polished, studio-fied guitar sound. So firstly, what I've done is add a tilt EQ, which boosts everything above 500 Hz as well as dropping everything below that. And I need to give a bit of credit to Jason Sudeikis for that idea. He has pioneered the use of that on Helix presets for ages now, and he has his own take on this tone too, so there's a link above for you. What also wasn't quite there for me in the sound was a small boost around 665 Hz. This just added a bit of a low mid honk that wasn't quite there before.
And just a quick side note about using EQ for your guitar tones. Don't discount the importance of it. I'm not just talking about your bass, middle and treble settings on your amp. I'm talking about further extensive EQ that goes on maybe on a mixing desk or in your recording software or whatever else. Because what you need to remember is most of your favourite guitar tones that you've heard on records will have been mixed in a studio by an engineer or a producer using that kind of equipment to really dial in the sound. So whether you're trying to replicate someone else's tone for production purposes, or you just like it and you want to use it as a launching pad to find your own sound, bear that in mind. So the final thoughts on this are that I would say it's a less is more sound, and the thing that people often seem to get wrong about this when they try and recreate the tone is to have a load more overdrive or distortion than is really necessary to get a big sound. When in actual fact this is probably achieved more by having a big, powerful, clear sounding and loud amp, which in Angus's case was added to with the clean boost that he got from his wireless system. The other thing that's essential when swapping between the rhythm and lead parts is the volume pot control, as I've pointed out. With the solos seemingly always on full volume, up to 10, full whack, whatever you want to call it, all of that Spinal Tap goodness. If he played like that all the time though, you have to realise that his sound would be very different. But thanks to his old school approach before the advent of channel changing amps that could boost your volume for your solos or whatever else, it meant that he could have ultimate control of his overall sound with very little fuss. Wonderfully simple and very effective. And now, for all the usual housekeeping that you get at the end of a video, you know the drill. If you enjoyed this video, please give it a like and subscribe to the channel so you can catch any content like this, plus anything else that I'm putting out that you will no doubt enjoy. And as usual, I am still taking bookings for one-on-one online guitar tuition, so you can get in touch with me about all of that in my socials, which I have linked as ever in the description below the video. Until the next one folks, stay safe out there, stay positive, and stay musical.